Hello and welcome to Politics and Prose. My name is Grant. I'm a bookseller here at our main location, where we host in-person events along with partnered and supported events, trips, and classes. We've recently relocated our branches at Union Market and the Wharf and have started hosting events there as well. For a full list of events, please check out our website, politics-prose.com. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask you to please silence your cell phones so as not to disrupt the event. When we get time for the opening the floor up to questions, we've placed a standing mic to your right next to this pillar. Please line up and speak into the microphone. The event is being live streamed, so we wanted to get the voices as clear as possible. Following the Q&A, we'll have a sign-in up here at this table. So if you're not already done so, please purchase the book up at our registers, and then please form a line over where we have the Q&A mic. After the event, we ask that you fold up your chairs and put them to your sides to help the event staff. Tonight, we have James Sears with his book, Queering Rehoboth Beach. Sears is an independent scholar focusing on queer history. He is the author or editor of numerous books, including Grown Up Gay in the South, Lonely Hunters, An Oral History of Lesbian and Gay Southern Life, 1948 through 1968, Behind the Mask of the Machina, the Hal Call Rhinestones, Queering Space in the Stonewall South. With Queering Rehoboth Beach, Sears, famous for employing its well-honed oral history skills in several books on gay history of the South, documents the growing tension between the town's residents who viewed themselves as a wholesome family-oriented community and the LGBTQIA+ newcomers. His great contribution is in the intimate, on-the-ground portrayals of the leaders and everyday people who made up the new Rehoboth and the institutions, bars, and guest houses they brought into existence. He has interviewed an impressive variety of people, including politicians, graphic designers, chemists, and partygoers. His book ability aptly utilizes several other kinds of credible resources as well. Please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, James T. Sears.
It's great being here, and I was just chatting with the staff earlier, and the last time, actually the first time I was here as a graduate student. Actually, from Indiana, but some students along with myself came, and we had the opportunity to come to the bookstore, which at that time, I don't know if any of you remember, was across the street and much smaller. So obviously this place has increased in space, and it's a real pleasure and honor to be here and also to chat with each of you, both individually and as a group. What I'd like to do here, I'm not going to read from the book, but what I'd like to do is make some general comments, and then I'll sort of pause, and then if some questions you have, then we'll work through questions. If not, then I'll continue to talk. So it'll be more of an iterative kind of presentation rather than simply a lecture and then questions, okay? And if we have a great conversation, then I don't need to lecture anymore, so to speak. I'm an old lecturer, I'm an old university professor, so believe me, I can lecture an hour, but I don't think you want to have that done to you. This book started actually when my husband, Luis, who's actually right here, he and I moved from the DC area to Rehoboth in 2019. And like many people, we first came to Rehoboth just as beachgoers and met some friends, etc. And like many people who lived in the DC area, we ended up migrating toward that area. In the book is unusual in one respect. I've written a lot of books, but in this book, it starts off very personal. And so the beginning of the book talks about 4 or 5 pages, but talks about our experience, my experience in one of the Rehoboth Beach restaurants. And the kind of experience we had was less than positive. Okay, but the way it was written, I tried to write it in a way that would allow the reader, that is you, to come up with other interpretations. My interpretation as a elder white male gay white male, was that basically what happened with that in that restaurant incident was basically homophobia. Okay, but Lewis's perspective was more of a racist kind of issue because he and I were together. But the whole point of that story is that that helped to motivate me to basically ask two questions. And one is, which I'm sure a lot of people have asked the question, how did Rehoboth become queer? Okay. And then the second question, which was specifically based on the restaurant experience, was how queer is Rehoboth, really? Or is it just at the surface level? Okay. So in the process of doing this, I had the opportunity to use the resources of Camp Rehoboth. Some of you may be familiar with that group, as well as the local library and also the museum. The book, basically, I interviewed more than 36 people. Some of those people I interviewed multiple times, and each interview was like between an hour and a half. All the interviews are videotaped, and they're available both at the museum in Rehoboth Beach, but also they're available in my papers at Duke University. And the reason I think that's important is because, again, I would like to encourage other people, other researchers, other writers to also be able to use those resources, because just like a movie director, you have all these scenes shot, and then all of a sudden now you have the realities of it can only be so long, right? So a lot of things got cut out. In the process of asking that question, how did Rehoboth become queer? I first had to understand Rehoboth Beach. And to me, the story of Rehoboth Beach not only begins in the 1870s, but there's a striking parallel between what happened with Rehoboth Beach Camp Meeting Association in 1870s, 1880s, and what happened with the emerging visible presence of gay men and lesbians in the 1970s through the 1990s, okay? And by that I mean is that during the time when Rehoboth was founded, the general story is that there was a person by the name of Reverend Todd who actually had a very wealthy Methodist congregation in Delaware, in Wilmington, and he had just lost his wife. He went to another camp meeting site in New Jersey, came back and had this vision. And the vision was to have a similar camp meeting place for people to go to enjoy the ocean, but also to engage in all the camp activities from sermons to prayers, etc., songs, etc. When he provided that vision to his congregation, people were excited. And some of the people who were excited were very wealthy industrialists. Okay, and so some of those people, for example, Hastings, who ran the largest plate steel mill in Wilmington, for example. There are also people in Baltimore, also people in D.C. And so about a month later, those people and other people traveled by train south towards Sussex County. And when they got to Lewis, there was no more train track or anything, so they had to take buggies or if they didn't have a lot of money, then they put money together for a wagon to get to Rehoboth, 7 miles away. And at that time, within a day, they had sold lots. Lots were selling for $50 a lot, if you can imagine that. Even at today's prices, that's still considerably less than what you can have to buy a lot today in Rehoboth. And they also got the institution chartered, so it was a state chartered organization, and had all the principles of Methodism. Now, I don't know how many people are familiar with Methodist discipline, but it's at least at that time, it was pretty strict. So, for example, there would be, of course, no drinking, but you couldn't you couldn't engage in any activities during Sundays, including shaving, for example, for men. There was no real amusements. You couldn't, for example, play 10 pins, which is the old version of bowling, okay? And so, and of course, you couldn't dance, because that sort of goes without saying, right? Very early on, they built a hotel, and they had sold lots. They had people coming in with tents and camps to camp there. It was only like a 2 or 3 week event. But one of the individuals who was one of the entrepreneurs, was a guy by the name of William Bright. And William Bright had he was the premier real estate person in Wilmington. In fact, he owned more properties in Wilmington than anyone else. He was also considered to be a Southern sympathizer. I can go on and on about that. But the bottom line is he was one of the investors, but he was the person who actually was able to set up the mortgage to buy that land. Okay, so what ended up happening, he ended up buying the note, and then the Camp Meeting Association paid him along with 6% interest, okay, which is pretty good at that period of time. He also built a hotel called the Bright Hotel. And this is where the story sort of gets interesting, because the Bright Hotel, since he owned the hotel and he also owned the land, although he was at the camp meeting site, they allowed for dancing. They didn't do drinking, but they did card playing, all those other nefarious kinds of things that you can't do as a good Methodist. And in the process of doing that, another individual by the name of Reverend Quigg, who was the sort of the elder of the Methodist Beach, or excuse me, elder of the Delmarva Methodist Association. So the Delmarva Methodist Association was established after the war between the states, or if you're from the South like I am, they would still say the War of Northern Aggression. But either way, that was established in Delmarva because there were so many Southern sympathizers, and they didn't want to be associated with the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania people, etc. So then you had basically within several years, I won't go into any more detail. I'm already gone into a lot more detail than I wanted to, expecting to. But anyway, so then you had eventually Reverend Quigg and his group became more and more upset because all this was going on at the Bright Hotel, the very things that were prohibited. And not only that, how many people have been to Rehoboth Beach area? Okay, great. Okay, so you know where Dewey Beach, okay, and you know the reputation that Dewey Beach has. Well, just across the line now, so one of the charter points for the Rehoboth Beach Camp Meeting Association was that their boundary went 10 feet beyond where their actual boundary was. So you couldn't do any of the bad things in that area. So you had a guy by the name of Douglas who opened up the Douglas Hotel in what is now Dewey Beach, precisely 10.1 feet off the border. And there you have the beginning of Dewey Beach, which is with its own legacy, okay? Having all said that, as tensions rose, you had basically two groups. You had what I would call the Methodist moralist, and you had sort of the entrepreneurial mercantilist, okay? And so you had one group who saw Rehoboth as being a place to replenish one's soul, and the other group saw their place as a place to replenish their bank account, okay? So within about 8 years, there was no more Rehoboth Camp Meeting Association. And what happened was there was elections, and you had the Quigg slate, and you had the Bright slate for board of directors, and ultimately the Bright slate won, and then all of a sudden the organization changed, and then within a few years after that, eventually Rehoboth Beach became a town. Now, what does this have to do with Queering Rehoboth? Obviously, at least as far as I know, Quigg wasn't queer, or neither was Bright, or any of those other individuals. But what it does is it sets us up for understanding how the small town emerged, and also for understanding the parallels between that and what happened by the mid-1970s, where all of a sudden you had the first restaurant that really didn't sell nickel boilies or fried chicken or French fries or whatever. And that was the cafe. And this cafe was opened in 1975, and by two heterosexual people and also by a gay man. Gay man's named Victor Pasapia. And so those three individuals opened up the Back Porch Cafe. And that was the beginning of a place where if you were gay or lesbian, the little bar there, which was maybe 8 feet, that was a place that you could go and be comfortable. Now, before that time, if you were queer, there were a lot of places to go to, okay, relatively speaking. That is, you could go to the beach, but you wouldn't just go to the beach. If you were back in the 50s or 60s, you would go to a place called Carpenter's Beach, past Carpenter's Beach, okay? And that was about a half a mile beyond Pluto Beach, or quarter mile. And to do that, you go across the Carpenter's compound. And the Carpenter, Louisa Carpenter, was very close relative to the DuPont family. So she's the heiress for that, okay? And Louisa Carpenter, as many of you may know, was also lesbian, Okay, and she had many lesbian friends who would come in the 1920s, 1930s, and enjoy that compound. Including people like Ephraim Zimbalist Jr., Noel Coward, who I'm trying to remember the woman's name, but it'll occur to me in a minute. But anyway, all these people were there, and at the time, and I talked to some people who remember that period of time. And it's sort of interesting because at the time, the town knew that there were these weird people coming by plane, because actually they had a private plane. Louisa Carpenter, among other things, she was a aviatrix, and she was also a master of the hound. She was very, very adept person. Okay, I could go into a lot about her also, but if you have a question about her, I can address that more. But ultimately, the Carpenter Beach became a place where gay men, mainly gay men, some lesbians, but mainly gay men would go, during the weekend or, to enjoy themselves, play Frisbee, listen to transistors radio, play volleyball, things like that. Now, there was also a place called the Pink Pony, and that was right on the boardwalk. Now, the Pink Pony was an interesting place because, again, it wasn't a gay bar, but it was, relatively speaking, accepting of people who were queer, particularly on the weekend or Sunday afternoon, etc. And so you had that place, and then you had a place by the early 1960s called the Nomad. And the Nomad was a very odd place. It was down by Bethany Beach. So again, if you're familiar with the area, but it was a pretty good drive down there. And it was a place where you walk in the bar and there would be these, Elvis, these, paintings you would see like that they'd be selling in Florida, those black sort of, I don't know what you call them, but, they're sort of monstrous kind of paintings of Elvis, and there's also paintings there of Egyptians, etc. So you'd walk in there, and by 1962-63, part of that bar became gay. And so if you were queer back in that time, and particularly if you were coming from areas where you wanted to make sure that people didn't know who you were, which is most areas, then that was a good, safe place to go. And I don't know how many people have seen it's a Showtime, A Fellow Travelers, a Showtime special. Has anybody seen that? It's a phenomenal telenovela, and it really focuses on Washington, D.C. in the 1950s and 1960s for gay and lesbians, okay, and working in the government. And what happened was basically is that when the Chesapeake Bridge was built in the early 1950s, that allowed for people from Washington, particularly people who were queer, to go to the beaches and being away from, relatively speaking, away from prying eyes. Okay, so that's sort of the genesis of the Queering of Rehoboth. Now, a lot of the book, in order to telling this, I could have told this as a straight story. That's, it's a straight historical story. This is what happened. Here's my analysis, etc. But like in many of my books, what I'm interested in is the perspective that people have, and the various perspectives that different actors have during this time of the Queering of Rehoboth, which again began with the Back Porch Cafe, and then went to the opening of the Renegade in 1980, and then the Blue Moon in 1981, and then all of a sudden it became much more public, and then you had a person by name, then you had a mayor there, Mayor Hughes, who ran on a platform of you need a strong man for the job, and ran against a woman. And when the woman was interviewed, what do you think about, these homosexuals who are coming in? Her response was, I think it's a good idea. They're fixing up houses, they keep the yards clean, etc. Well, she lost 2-1. Okay. And Hughes was the mayor for most of that decade. So as Rehoboth became more queer, you also had the forces of reaction against this new group that they always knew existed, but they were fine with them coming in, spending money, but they did not want at all to be associated with being queer as Rehoboth. And they certainly didn't want to see 2 men or 2 women holding hands walking down the boardwalk. At that period of time, then, you had more restaurants opening. And this is really an aspect of, if you're interested in social activism, how a community changes, okay? And one reason it changed is because it didn't start with activists per se. It started with, again, entrepreneurs. okay, the restaurateurs, the people that came from DC and Baltimore and Philadelphia, opening up summer shops, okay, who were queer or progressive. And then as that evolved, eventually you had the major event, okay, of the 1980s, which was the opening of the Strand nightclub. So if you can imagine this small town of 2,000 people, which of course got much larger, by at least 10 times during the summertime, on the middle second block of Rehoboth Avenue, having this giant nightclub that didn't even open till midnight. And this nightclub was modeled after the nightclubs in New York during that period of time. And so for opening day, for example, they at midnight or 11:30 or so, they had a line going from the Strand doorway all the way down past the post office, all the way around Second Avenue, all the way down, halfway down Baltimore Avenue. And they weren't dressed in their church-going clothes, okay? So they were dressed in particularly dance clothes, queer clothes, etc. So people were aghast. And so part of this story of Queering Rehoboth is, again, how the town responded. And the town responded in many ways the same way as the Meeting Association, the Methodists, responded in the 1870s and 1880s. Okay, they pulled out rules that they were violating. They took them to court. There were elections. There were referendum, etc. Now, eventually, as we know, things changed. Okay, part of the book questions whether who changed more, the town or the people who were queer, or was it a combination? And I'll leave you as a reader to figure that out or to come to some sort of conclusion. But I want to conclude here, and then I'm going to stop for a pause for comments or questions, and then I can go on, is that I focus on 6 people. And these 6 people, women and men, are all people who were in Rehoboth by 1980. And these individuals all played a really critical role in the queering of modern Rehoboth. But they were not all of the same thinking. And in fact, some of them were diametrically opposed to one another. Okay, so for example, the owner of the Renegade was a diehard conservative from DC originally, but he was absolutely opposed to what was going on, for example, in the Blue Moon. Okay, and so in telling their stories, the question is, for me as a writer and as a researcher, is what brought them to the actions that they came to? So for example, why did a person like Glenn Thompson, the Renegade, who was the owner of the Renegade, he also owned a number of bars in DC, Fraternity House is just one example of one. How could someone who was obviously gay and grew up in a very, 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 very poor family, how could someone like that then all of a sudden take such a negative position against people who were also gay, who were also trying to build up the community? And as Joyce Felton, the owner of one of the co-owner of the cafe or of the Blue Moon, said, we're all the more businesses we have, we're all going to thrive more. Okay, that was her perspective. That wasn't Glenn Thompson's perspective. To understand these questions, then you have to understand, I believe, those individuals as human beings. So, for example, who was Joyce Felton? Joyce Felton was this radical from Brooklyn. She founded the first SDS high school chapter in the country. After she graduated from high school, she went to South Carolina, where I used to work. And this was 1968, 69. And she went there ostensibly to go to the University of South Carolina, but she was really there to organize, okay, through the SDS, okay? And if you know the history of that period of time, whether it was in South Carolina or here in DC, there was a lot of organizing, there was a lot of anti-war, pro-feminist, et cetera, things going on. And she was in the middle of that. Okay, so that's her background. As I mentioned, Glenn Thompson had a very different background, and each of these people bring to this event or this 20-year period a personal history that I believe really tells you a lot about the reasons why they ended up doing what they did, and also the perspectives. And in understanding those perspectives, and I talk about in the book about memory. I'm asking people to think back 20 or 30 or 40 years, okay? Now, I provide lots of questions ahead of time. I provide examples, etc. But again, what they say in those oral interviews is a refraction of that memory, which is important to think about, okay? Now, obviously, I used newspapers. I interviewed lots of people, so I could begin to sort of triangulate in a positive sense, their stories. But ultimately, it was their memories of what happened. Now, when camp started, basically in 1990, and the letters began in 1991. When camp started, it started with four gay men, okay, and their goal was to reach out to the community and to engage the community, not in an activist, act up kind of sense, but in a collegial sense, to say, how can we become part of that community? That was their philosophy. And one of the leaders of that group was actually a former aide for Jimmy Carter. So you can get a sort of sense that their philosophy was a centrist philosophy. Okay. So you have all these different groups of people and individuals who are interacting in this sort of cauldron in the small, and I would call Rehoboth small southern town, because if you're in Sussex County, even today, it feels more southern than it does feel, I believe, than it feels like it's northern, if you want to make that distinction. So that's basically how the book is laid out. So when you read the book, I ask you as the reader to bring your perspective to these individuals, particularly these 6 people who have such very different perspectives, not only to which ones you resonate to, but also to try to see, you perhaps have a different interpretation than what I do. And certainly you might have more questions that I was able to answer. Okay. But in the process, the ultimate question is, not only how Rehoboth became queer, which I address, but is Rehoboth queer? Really? And I've spoken to many people who say, well, it used to be queer back 20, 30 years ago, but now it's just like every other beach town. Okay. And I understand that perspective. But that also reflects a different generational perspective. If you're lesbian or gay growing up in the 50s or 60s, or if you're lesbian and gay growing up in the aughts, a very different perspective. So let me stop there because I can keep going, as you can see. I tried to cover lots of territory without going into a great amount of depth. And we already have a person here, so that's great.
First of all, I need to compliment you on your choice of hats and the way you wear them. I'm going to try tilting mine and see how that looks in the mirror.
Thank you. Thank my husband.
I'm very cis. And grew up I spent summers at the Jersey Shore.
Okay.
So when my late husband and I discovered Rehoboth in 1980.
Okay.
We started going. We learned quickly not to go during the summer, but in the spring and in the fall. We would go 10 or 12 times a year, and we used to stay at the Henlopen.
Okay.
And we did that from then until 1997 when he died. And I haven't been back since because it's no fun to go alone. And I should tell you, we were completely oblivious. I had no idea. And Marty didn't have any idea. Marty he was a wonderful guy and did all kinds of marvelous things. And we had a wonderful marriage. He was sort of homophobic. Mm-hmm. He didn't, it sort of came out. But it wasn't an issue for us because everybody was in the closet.
Right.
And we had friends who turned out to be gay, and he had no idea, and frankly, neither did I. And when I found out, it didn't bother me at all. But anyhow, just to say, it never occurred. It just was, we were oblivious. I had no idea. Was it more obvious after 1997? Mm-hmm. Or was it was just always there, and we went from the hotel to the beach to the restaurants, mm-hmm. some of which you mentioned. Yeah. We were there, just clueless.
Yeah, thank you. And that's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. One aspect of the word queering, which I use, mm-hmm. and that is queering, among other things, means how do you take space, which is ostensibly quote unquote heterosexual straight space, and how does it get queered, even though people who are operating on one level of the space just see it as being an ordinary place. If you are in the know, then you understand what's going on. Now, even like you mentioned, the Henlopen Hotel back in the 70s, and again, this is the only place you really had was the,
That's
afternoon drink at the Pink Pony or going down to Nomad. The other place you could go,
There were restaurants.
was the upstairs of the Henley Hotel, the bar. And at that time, there was, this is 1970s, okay? And at that time, like many places around the country, and I've done a lot of research on the South, if you were queer, and particularly if you're a gay man, and you were new to the area and you didn't have one of those little black books, and they were really small little books that told you where things might be, then you would go to the nicest hotel in town and go to that bar, okay? And there you'd be on the watch for just very subtle gestures, okay? And that was what the Henley Hotel was like, okay, during the summertime, okay? So that queering of the space, how space gets queered and how it changes, okay? So, for example, Poodle Beach wasn't even called Poodle Beach and wasn't even used as a gay place until 1980 or 81. Similarly, North Shores, which is near where the Biden house is now, North Shores was primarily a place where you were, if you were a lesbian, you would go there to enjoy yourself. But before that time, it was called Whiskey Beach. Now, Whiskey Beach was a place where, this is back in the 60s and basically in the 60s, and that's where places where kids, college kids and high school kids were hanging out, play music, drink, etc. It's a heterosexual space, okay? But to give you an example of how the city approached differences, and that's really the key here in understanding Rehoboth, how a small town approaches differences, is that the town didn't like that. The town didn't like the idea that you had all these kids playing sort of rock music and enjoying themselves, and they weren't doing anything illegal, okay, per se, probably. But anyway, so they barred any kind of music being played in that area, okay, during the summertime. So one of the owners of, I think it was the Rusty Rudder, and another person who was actually a gadfly, both of these guys are straight, they rented a barge, and they got the barge to pull up within, 20 meters of the beach, and they had a rock band there, and they played music. Okay, and why did they do it? Well, because obviously they didn't have any infraction of an ordinance, because the ordinance says you can't have music played on the beach, and they weren't on the beach. And that's an important thing about small towns. And I talk a lot about small towns in the book, is that small towns, if you grow up in small towns, then a part of you, your memory is of that town when you were small, okay? And the last thing you want to do is see that town change. And so the history of Rehoboth, like the history of many small towns, is how it reacts to change. And Rehoboth, more than most towns, over the decades, have reacted to changes of different types. So whether it was the blanket people in the 1960s, or whether it was people that were coming in the 1980s who were openly homosexual, they did the same thing. They adopted ordinances, okay? They enforced ordinances selectively. Okay, they had a whole litany of things to do that prescribed or proscribed those individuals from operating. So if you had a tattoo parlor, what would you, at least a place in Rehoboth as a tattoo parlor, what would you do? First thing, you get a knock on the door, and there'll be a councilman saying, this is a tattoo parlor. Are you sure this really fits with Methodist principles or Christian principles? Thinking back in the mind, the biblical thing about, having something on your tattooed on you. And then if that didn't work, then you have the mayor saying, well, I'm not sure that you are following all the ordinances of the town, okay? And then they adopt other ordinances, like the tattoo parlor. They said, if you're going to have a tattoo parlor in the town of Rehoboth, then you must have, when you're open, you must have a medical doctor there at all times, knowing that that was prohibitively expensive. So that's how the small town of Rehoboth dealt with difference. So when you're reading the book, you have to ask yourself, how much of, just like the restaurant scene in the beginning of the book, how much of that has to do with homophobia? How much has that to simply do with a narrowness in terms of understanding of what small town life is like?
Thanks. And you've also explained the reason why Rehoboth has a biblical name. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll take 2 bites at the apple, and you can just answer one question or both if you're having fun with it.
Okay.
The first question is about why Rehoboth, and this might be giving away too much from the book, but it was very compelling for you to explain the idea of Rehoboth being a place for DC professionals to get away from prying eyes and spend their money. But why Rehoboth Beach? As there are many locations along this swath of Delaware, why not Bethany Beach or Ocean City gaining this reputation? Is there something kind of structurally happening with Rehoboth that enables this? And the second question is if you can offer any speculation or if there was anything in your research about the connection to Biden. Biden, long known for being someone who has visited Rehoboth Beach many times, enjoys the area, also someone who's known for his big transformations, I suppose, or arcs in his beliefs or policies when it comes to LGBT rights. Is he moving at all in these queer spaces or something like that?
Two great questions, and I'll try to answer both as succinctly as an old professor can. The first one would be, yes, there was Bethany Beach, and there was also Ocean City. Now, the last place a queer person would want to be is in Ocean City. Why? Not just because of the high rise, but because of the police and the attitude of, there was an absolute no tolerance of anything gay in that town. Okay, so that was one of the last places you would want to be if you're queer. Now, up until 1980, a lot of people, particularly people from the Philly area, probably some from Baltimore, I'm not sure so much from DC, would go to the beaches on Jersey. Okay, but then, if you recall, two things happened in Jersey. In the what's the gambling town in Jersey? I forget the name. Always forget what. Atlantic City, thank you. I always have that mental block. Atlantic City. Atlantic City, if you went down New York Avenue, just a couple blocks behind their boardwalk, that was a very big gay scene there. Okay, lots of things going on. But what happened by 1980? What happened was, well, several things, but the most important was the casinos. As the casinos were established, all of a sudden these old dilapidated buildings worth very little, and the land was worth enormous amount of money. So that changed that entire scene. The second thing that happened is during that period of time, you had pollution coming into the ocean on the Jersey Shore. Some of you may remember that. So at that point in time, particularly gay people from Philadelphia and particularly from Baltimore, went from, instead of going to the Jersey area, they'd come down to Rehoboth. And that was, again, the beginning of Rehoboth becoming sort of a known queer mecca. This was beginning of the Blade had been operating for several years. The first stories in the Gay Blade, the Washington Gay Blade, was in 1980, in 1981. So if you were a gay man, particularly, you would read these stories. All of a sudden, now you had the Renegade, which was a great dance club, and you had this beach, etc. Now, if you're a woman and you're a lesbian, it was very different. You really didn't have a bar to go to, a queer lesbian bar. You could go to the North Shore, but also, given the fact that women were making much less than men and still do, that the amount of disposable income that women had compared to gay men was significantly different. So what they could afford in terms of lodging, etc., was not what gay men could afford. So oftentimes then women from Baltimore and DC, etc., they would come, but then they would stay with friends. They would stay friends maybe over in Lewis or maybe all far away as Milford, etc., and then they come to the beach. Okay, but that was what was going on. Now, in terms of Biden went to the back porch cafe often. Okay, and one of the stories that was told to me is he would go over there with Jill and usually some other people, and then someone during the meal he would go into the kitchen and they would let him use their phone in the kitchen and he would do business. Okay, so he was fine with the back porch cafe, etc. Now, when he first ran for office, and some of you may remember that in the early 70s, he ran against a pretty staunch homophobe. But when he ran for office and then he was elected, he also had town meetings. And one of the town meetings that he was at was in a neighborhood near Dover, Wilmington area. And one of the people asked him a question. There were about 30, 40 people in the homeowners group that were there. And one person stood up and said, Senator, I'm just sort of curious, what is your position about homosexuals in the military? And he sort of looked at, and you just picture Biden in 1973 or so, sort of giving that sort of look, and sort of thinking about that, and said honestly, well, I haven't given that much thought. And then he paused and he said, darn. And that was his first real confrontation. Now, the person who asked that question was a name by the name of Robert Vane. And also to understand the queering of Rehoboth, you have to understand the queering of Delaware. And really all the activities, all the organizations were occurring in the Wilmington area. And Robert Vane was a singular individual who was responsible, along with the ACLU, in eliminating the sodomy statute in Delaware, and was also trying really hard to adopt a state law that would prohibit discrimination. Okay, he got 2 votes. They got 2 votes out of the assembly of maybe, I think, 60 at the time, but one of the no votes said a nay in a falsetto voice. So you can sort of gauge the attitudes. This was in the early 1970s. And so part of this book also, you think, well, all I want to do is read about Queer Rehoboth. Well, you're going to read a lot more than about Queer Rehoboth. You're going to learn more about Rehoboth as a town. Forget about the gays and the homosexuals and the lesbians and the trans people. You're going to learn more about basic small town life in Rehoboth than you know, even if you live there for 20 or 30 or 40 years. Similarly, you're going to learn a lot about Delaware activism, particularly in the 1970s, 1980s, the lesbian hotline, the Dykes hotline, what was going on at the University of Delaware, et cetera. Because all that is context. And the larger context, of course, is what was going on across the country and what was going on here in D.C. and Maryland. But I won't get into that.
Hi. When I think back to Rehoboth in the 70s, when Joel and I first started going there, we had the idea that we were going to open a movie theater on top of the bowling alley that was on Rehoboth Avenue.
Where the Strand eventually became.
Yeah. Well, that was not a good idea, because what we found out very quickly was that Rehoboth was run by certain wealthy families, and they were friends with the property owners, and they didn't want any young kids coming in and changing their town one iota. And we had every pushback until we finally just realized we can't go up against the structure of Rehoboth. And I don't know what's happened to these families in the years since, whether their children left.
No, those families are still there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead. The other thought I have is, as I was sitting here in line, I was thinking about how when it first became, when all the bumper stickers came to Rehoboth that said, "Keep Rehoboth a family town." Most of the gay life that we witnessed was very preppy. And you could tell that these were maybe Capitol Hill aides or writers. They very similarly dressed, not at all flamboyant. And I used to complain to Joel, like, why isn't this more like Provincetown? And so I have that question, why did it never become more like?
Well, rather than going into the history of Provincetown and to make a distinction, which I can, but I won't, is that you're absolutely right. If you went to the Blue Moon in the 1980s, and let's say you were a gay man and you worked on the Hill, and a group of you and a group of friends were going to go there for the weekend. The first thing you do, probably somewhere around Wednesday, at latest Thursday, would be to call the Blue Moon and talk to Joyce or talk to Victor. Victor Pasapia was the co-owner of the Blue Moon. And you'd say, "Hey, Victor," or "Hey, Joyce, what's going on this weekend?" Because again, for those of you that are under 30 or whatever, there was no internet, okay, right? So it was all by word of mouth. And so the Blue Moon served as sort of a hub for information for what was going on. And actually, if you want to say, sort of a high-priced community center in a sense. So if you're coming from Philadelphia, and you still had to come down some onerous roads from Philadelphia all the way down to southern Delaware, you'd want to arrive on Friday no later than 4 o'clock in the afternoon, because the Blue Moon by 4 o'clock and the bar area and also the patio area would be just packed. Packed of whom? Packed of white, gay men, okay, of some affluence. Okay, now, having said that, that's partly the explanation for the dress. Okay, one of the observations I make, and also I tell these stories in the book, is what if you were a lesbian and came to Rehoboth during the 80s or so, but what if you were a person of color? What if you're a person who was disabled? What if you were who was a person identified as a cub or a bear? If you're a person who was trans, who didn't want to just be a performer? Okay, there was no space there. Okay, no space within the queer community. Okay, because all that was defined basically by the ability to purchase entry into that town. Okay, not that it was not to live there, but just to spend the week there. So for many, many years, camp would host a event in one of the gay bars here in D.C., and it would be an event like a fraternity race. Okay, I never joined a fraternity. I was doing other things like bringing my draft card. But the fraternity race kind of concept is you'd come in and there'd be drinks and everything, but then you'd have people on different tables and they'd be different houses. So you'd have like, this is the 781 Laurel Street house. This is and these are the organizers of these houses. Okay, and then you would go around and talk to each of the people. They would size you up, you would size them up, and again, almost all white, definitely all men, okay? And that's how these houses started. And paradoxically, they grew as the town became more, the town itself, the homeowners association became more intransigent in their position, okay? So, and in fact, there was also directories. Every year, camp would publish a directory, so you'd have all the names of all the people. Because again, you didn't have cell phones; you could just connect to cell phones. Oh, so and people didn't carry business cards if you're gay. So I'm a gay person. This is my number. So what you would do is you would have this directory. You'd be listed by all your last names, but also it'd be listed by houses. So this street on Philadelphia Street, 9991. I'm just making up a number. Philadelphia Street. Here are all the names of the people in that house, and out of that then. And those people would pay for, basically, the gay men would pay for either every other week or every week. And every other week or every week means every other weekend, okay, not every other week, okay? And they would pay that full amount of money up front, okay? So again, if you don't have the money, disposable money, you can't do that. And in the process of doing that, they would be celebrating lots of different things. So there was shows, there were different kinds of shows where people were given prizes, etc. But all these people were people of a certain social class, a certain race, and a certain gender. Now, in the old days, in Rehoboth, back in the 70s, okay, where the homosexuals understood their place and weren't flamboyant, okay, and kept to their place way over on Carpenter's Beach. In those days, you actually had more maneuverability as a gay man and also as a lesbian. As a gay man, you could go to Baltimore Avenue. There's a guest house there now, a gay guest house in Baltimore Avenue. That's where this guest house was called Paradise Inn. And it was started by a Latino and his white German lover in the late 1970s. And this is a place, it had like 9 bedrooms. First thing they did is they took the 9 small bedrooms and cut them up to halves. So you had 18 rooms, okay, 2 stories, okay, and it was relatively cheap, okay. And if you're a gay man, it was only men. You would go there, and it was actually a low scale. Bathhouse, okay? In the sense that you had a place to stay, but after midnight or so, there would be sort of cruising around, etc. If you were into that, the owner, one of the owners, the German guy, at around 10:30 or 11 o'clock, he would bring his VW van, which would reek to pot, and he would take the van and say, "It's first call. We're going to the Renegade. If you want to come in. Come on, let's go." Okay, and he would drive everybody to the Renegade. Okay, and then around 1 or 2 o'clock, he'd come back and take a couple of trips, etc. Now, those people didn't get along real well with the Blue Moon and Joyce Felton because there was different group of people. Okay, if you were really poor and you were like college age, you could actually camp in the backyard of the Paradise Inn as long as you're willing. If you brought your camp equipment, you're willing to pay $5 for the night and didn't mind hearing some groans and things in the backyard during the nighttime. Then we were fine. So those are the kinds of places that were invisible to the town. I mean, they might have heard a rumor about it, but no one tried to do anything. Okay, as things became more visible, like in most cities, the people's first reaction was negative, and then of course this dovetailed with the AIDS crisis, which of course not only galvanized the gay community, but also created the very reaction from Bryan and from the Briggs Amendment, etc., which then created its own reaction among gays and lesbians. So to understand Rehoboth, you have to understand all these different kinds of layers that are going on. The old people in the town, you mentioned the movie house. The movie houses were run by one family, Okay, they bought out the other people by the 1950s. They're the same people that own. If you drive into Rehoboth on the left side, you'll see like there's a Chinese restaurant buffet. There's a movie house there. They own that. Okay, they own that whole complex actually. Okay, so that's the old family. So you had one family. Now the people that owned the bowling alley where the Strand was, long time ago, back in the 1930s. Well, this was built as a fire station, but also served, the top floor served as a place where people could go and dance. Now, this was formal dancing. 1930s, you'd bring your heterosexual date, you'd be well clothed, etc. And so there was a very nice wooden floor up there, okay? And eventually also became a bowling alley. Now, all of that was owned by the Larsons. The Larsons got in a feud with another family who were much more powerful. And again, I tell the story in the book, which has nothing directly to do with gays, except it tells you a lot about the town, how basically Larson eventually leased that building out to Joyce and Victor, which then became this giant nightclub. So just to get back at these people, he said, okay, well, we'll do that, okay? So if you like to learn a lot about small town life, you'll learn about the mayor's son, and you'll learn about one of the families who's if you go to Rehoboth, there'll be one real estate company that you see a name a lot of, and that name Lingo is everywhere. Okay, now many years ago, like 40 years ago, one of the Lingo kids in his 20s had a really hot car and would be driving, speeding down the Rehoboth Avenue or whatever. He got lots of tickets. Okay. Finally, one rookie cop apparently pulled him over, and had been drinking. The driver had been drinking. The kid had been drinking, and actually gave him a ticket. Okay, which was like not good, and hauled him to jail, which is even really not good. Okay, so ultimately, what happened? Well, the family calls the mayor calls the police chief. The kid is released. Everything's pulled off, but then all of a sudden, the Attorney General of the state of Delaware finds out about this, and all of a sudden now there's repercussions. Okay, but that's one of the few times there were repercussions. So understanding Rehoboth, if you've ever lived in a small town, I grew up in a small town, you don't need to live in Rehoboth to enjoy the book. You also, if you're an activist, you don't need to say, well, we're not Rehoboth, because one of the strategies, the question about a political strategy is, do you, in fact, engage as much as you can with other people who have different perspectives, and which again is why I began with that preamble of the story with Lewis and I in the restaurant. Do you try to enter the public square with an open mind, open heart, and engage with the other who has different perspectives? That's what Camp did. And during that period of time, even the Homeowners Association, and I can go into examples why that happened, but even the Homeowners Association eventually changed. Okay, and in fact, Rehoboth became queer. Now, there's two questions there that you need to answer as a reader. One is that possible today, in today's arguably much more dichotomous kind of society? Okay, is that even possible for people to engage in listening to one another? Okay, even in small towns. And then the second is, if you think about places like Rehoboth, okay, or places like Rehoboth that have now become, quote, queer, is, again, gay or queer only for a certain group of people, okay? Now, going to Rehoboth this year, I see more people of color walking the boardwalks, okay, which is great. Okay. But the bottom line is, who changed more? The Homeowners Association and the people that owned the property and the people that were on the council, city council, or the people, these usurpers, these queer usurpers, who eventually became leaders of the Homeowners Association, eventually had seats on the town council, eventually had houses in Rehoboth, and are now concerned about things that they don't like, such as a theater that's being built. Okay, not down in Rehoboth, but on the farther side of Rehoboth. So I'm going to stop there. We have time maybe for a couple more questions. I know I talk a lot, so I apologize, but that's who I am. You don't have a question if you have a comment, or you don't need to use the microphone. You can just yell. Okay, well, I think we've gone 1 hour. I want to say I did not intend to write this book. I only wrote the book because I had something to do. I mean, because I don't need tenure. I had tenure. I no longer work at the university. I don't need the money, and I'm not going to get much money for the book anyway. But I wrote the book because I was interested about those two questions. And so I approached the book in what I think was an objective way. Some people could call me an academic carpetbagger, because Louise and I lived just across the canal for 3 years. So we weren't in Rehoboth, we were on the outskirts of Rehoboth. I talk a lot about in the book about West Rehoboth, which is the area that we lived in, and how that impacted and did not impact Rehoboth. So there's a lot of strands to pull, shall we say, in this book. And if you're looking for something that closes up all those strands, that gives you a nice little bundled answer at the end, you're not. Now, I give you my perspective at the end of the book. But that's just my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, James. That was amazing.